When I was one, my parents became full-time church planters in Ghana, West Africa. And so, what's interesting about that is I spent my whole childhood, all my adolescence, and even into high school, watching my dad do that work. Um, and I was telling someone the other day, it's interesting, we didn't have any of the tools back then that we have now for movement. In fact, no one was even using this is 1981. Didn't have any words for movement. The DNA was there, the tools weren't quite there. And so we'll just fast forward, so that's my early childhood and just being a part of that, being just cutting my teeth, so to speak, on the work, as we would say, as you would see in Acts chapter 13 and 14, that work. And so when I was, I was exposed to early stages of movement. I was a single young missionary in China in 2001, 2002. And in those days, a dear brother by the name of Ying Kai was around. Steve Smith was around.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got first exposure in the T4T world in those days as a young man. It happens to be where I met my wife. We then transitioned back to the US for a bit, got married, and ended up in India for roughly 10 years. So that exposure, obviously, the upbringing, but then T4T added tools, very specific tools, not so much at that point gospel sharing tools, more disciple making tools and rhythms to I guess my knowledge and understanding of movement. And so in India, boy, that was in those days. That was 2007 when we landed in India. And it was like a sandbox of movement in those days. And I don't know, I was with an organization that in those days, our leader was David Garrison. And so anyone familiar with his writings, that's sort of where this began, where he began to bring in all the ideas and the lessons learned. You got the elements of movement. And so just really beginning to understand worldwide at that point. And a lot of that stuff that he wrote about was happening or had happened in India. And so there was a legacy of that through a lot of dear brothers that had been working there for many years. And of course, in China and other places around. And so as I guess a young married man at that point, we had one child, a baby with us, and we lived up in the mountains in Himachal Pradesh. That was pretty isolated back then. Actually, still probably isolated, but just that state had roughly 6 million people, the majority of whom were high caste Hindu, which was really interesting because most states, it's a mesh and a mix of castes. But for some reason, mostly because of persecution and people having to flee up into the mountains, it ended up with a high percentage of high caste, which was just a really interesting cocktail for ministry. Very difficult work, very. And it was also where Hinduism and Buddhism just began to syncretize and meet. And they had for maybe thousands of years, but hundreds of years at least. And so in some of those towns up in the mountains in the Himalayas, you would find each community would have their Hindu temple and their Buddhist temple on the same property. And it was almost sort of like, choose your religion of the day. And there were certainly those that were more devoted to one over the other, but it's just a strange cocktail up there. And so this would be a Lamaism, really, not really Buddhism, but Lamaism from Tibet. And they just revered the power structures of the lamas. And it's more worship of lamas, if I'm honest, than anything else. And then, of course, the Hinduism, for some reason along the way, it became called Hinduism. I think the British probably had something to do with that back in their days. But every village has its own belief. And what's strange is every village has their own gods. And
Mm-hmm.
usually there's a male and a female god. The encouragement I received from those mentors was to try and find any like-minded believers in the state where I lived and cast vision for them, and then offer training, and then begin working together with anyone who was interested. So the problem with that, Steve, was I mentioned the spiritual context. There weren't very many. They just weren't. And so, like, we, in the town I lived in, there was probably two or three actual churches that had buildings. And then across the entire state, there weren't many at all. Just unless the British left them behind, there weren't any. And so everything was moved underground, high
Mm-hmm.
persecution context. So we spent a lot of time praying, how are we going to find partners in a place where there's no real open Christian presence? How does this work? So a lot of time praying, just really asking Jesus to give us the answer to that question. So not knowing what to do, I began visiting churches, whatever I could find, on Sundays. There's a little Baptist church in the town. I mean, little, like 20 people meeting. There was the Anglican church. And just like little things like that happening. I would visit them on Sunday mornings because that's when they meet. And I would just kind of have tea with anyone who was willing and cast a little vision. Through that, we met one or two who caught the vision. I wouldn't say one or two that were necessarily fruitful in terms of gospel sharing and disciple making, excuse me, but one or two that realized that this was something that we were presenting was maybe a little more biblical, a little more faithful to the
Mm-hmm.
text of actually Great Commission type work. And so through those one or two, we put together, they would open up networks of believers across the state. And so known to them were others, most of them, in remote places and underground, and in terms of meeting in churches and gathering together. And so that began to open up a few networks. And then I felt like a traveling salesman for the first year, Steve. My wife and I and our baby and some partners would get in our 4x4, and we drove countless days through the mountains, and we would just make contact. And I would sit in people's, small huts or, just small dwellings, and cast vision for them. Um, anyone who would open the door, we just didn't have that many to work through. So I would go to
Mm-hmm.
anyone with a pulse who would open the door. And we sat there in broken Hindi. It was the first year, and we were doing our best, and no one speaks English out there. So, and we would cast a little vision here, throw some seeds there, all the way across the state, and just travel it, sometimes hiking into places and spending some days on trails, baby on the back, um, and people people caught on to some vision, a small percentage. We would cast a lot of seed, but some of it took root. And so from that, we established 3 or 4 different potential training spots, locations, where people would come in, usually underground type stuff. They would come into someone's home, and or a small rented building or hotel room, and receive training. Very basic stuff back then. Just at that time, we were using tools like the Romans Road, which is a great tool. And with a bridge diagram, which is a great tool. And
Mm-hmm.
so we had people memorizing 4 verses in Romans to get to, gospel and inviting people into a relationship with Jesus. And then we were using very simple 7 commands type stuff. I think that had kind of come over uh, by that point from Central America. And so just really simple, basic things that we were training. We saw um, we saw some churches start out of that. None of those early believers, we didn't lead any of them to faith. And I think that's important to note, because someone had done a lot of hard work before we got there.
Mm-hmm.
It looked a little different, but someone had laid a foundation of the gospel, and people had come to faith in Jesus and had some formulation of disciple making, and many times even some idea of church
Mm.
by the time we entered the scene. And so, yeah, uh, I'll tell you. I'll tell you a story. We'll call him Singh, uh, and that pseudonym is actually really good because there's a lot of Singhs in India. But Singh, when we met him, I met him. Someone else was doing a conference in town. I love it. Uh, it was actually like a prosperity gospel conference going on across town, and for some reason, I caught wind of it from another partner. There weren't many believers in this town I lived in, not many at all. In fact, I probably knew most of them, except for this one who was hosting this conference. And an American had come in and was doing some, sort of prosperity type stuff. And I was interested who was going to show up.
Mm.
So you've heard of wedding crashers. I was sort of a Christian conference crasher at that point because I wanted to put eyes on those from the town that I didn't know yet, and maybe do a little fishing and see who was interested
Mm.
in disciple making. So I end up at this place, and the guy who hosted it was an American who came through and did the speaking. The guy who hosted it, we called Singh. Singh, um, boy, I got the feeling that he was genuinely transformed by Jesus and by the gospel. Some people you can just kind of tell
Mm.
by the way they hold themselves, the way they speak.
Yeah.
It ended up he was from a high caste Hindu background, which was rare to have a believer. They have so much to lose, as you can
Mm.
imagine, with
Mm.
identity, to identify with Christ. And he had received a lot of persecution as the story goes, as we get to know each other. Well, I ended up inviting him to my house the following week or sometime, post the event, because with someone else's show, I didn't want to be rude. Uh, that traveling evangelist or traveling prosperity gospel guy went back to the US. And so I ended up really focusing in on this guy and just casting vision for him, going out sharing the gospel with him. I find um, you can spend a lot of time in India drinking tea with people, pastors, Christians, evangelists, but a shortcut to finding if they're really hungry and wanting
Yeah.
to be faithful and making disciples is to get into the harvest with them.
Mm.
For me, it's a shortcut. It's just a filter.
Mm.
And so most of them, I wouldn't say were unwilling, but very hesitant, didn't have a practice of getting into the harvest, and so just wanted to drink tea and make plans. This guy, we got into the harvest immediately. And
Mm.
he was faithful to share, and
Mm.
his wife was faithful to share. And they had a daughter who was sharing. I mean, it was obvious the Lord was doing something. And so Sting, we saw several people come to faith. We saw some. He had a church that was meeting underground already. Like I said, none of these guys came to faith from my witness,
Mm.
um, but from others before us. And so he had a small group meeting. And so what we ended up training considerably that small group, and
Mm.
we saw from that small group, uh, evangelism happen, disciple making happening in other communities, and then small churches begin to come out of that. And then some churches, we went on some training and evangelism circuits with him, with Singh, in that part of India, and we would see small churches pop up in some of those places as well. Again, we're not talking mega movement at this
Yeah.
point. We're talking just small starts, sparks,
Mm.
embers of the
Mm.
gospel taking root in some tough communities. Um, so that's Singh. He's still at it today.
Wow.
The Lord is laying on our hearts, my wife and I, a deep desire for the unreached and unengaged peoples of South Asia, which is was a lot, still a lot, unfortunately. But in those days, that's 2010. This is a lot of people, and we
Mm.
had a good number of them with a large population, over 100,000, many of over a million. We moved to a centralized location. We moved to Delhi to kind of be in the midst of that. First of all, Delhi, as a megacity, as one of the world's largest, but also as central influence on the whole, country, because it's the capital region. People from everywhere were coming into that city and then going out. And so there was a lot more overlap with peoples, especially these unengaged, and then a lot more potential for partnership and vision casting. It's just a different environment in Delhi than it was way out isolated in the mountains. So we transitioned into a role within the same organization to sort of spearhead entry points into those unengaged, in a sense, to help catalyze the engagement of those peoples. But the Lord was at work already and had been at work.
Mm.
We would find believers in those peoples, and the truth is, we just didn't know they were there. So the
Yeah.
more people we asked, the more connections we made in places like Bihar and Haryana and Rajasthan and these really tough and remote areas, we would find these people. So working with a network, again, how it works, some people invited us for training, and we said, we'd love to come for training. Here's the list of people groups that are unengaged. As far as we know, they have no gospel witness in Bihar. There were 17 at that point over the population of 100,000. 17. And some of those were in the millions. So it was a large population segment. Of course, that state has 100 million. So, we put out the list. We asked for, if you can find believers. Honestly, Steve, we were looking for believers. We were looking for as deep as we could go. But I was willing to take anyone who came from that background just so I could have an audience to share the gospel with them and meet them and train them. Well, we ended up getting, filling, let's say, 40 people trainings with 5 from this people group and 2 from that people group and 1 from this people group. And, as we networked, we found these believers or so-called believers. One of those, Manan, so Manan was from this people that I think roughly 250,000 odd people from a really awkward social caste. And to understand India would take days to even go into that. But this caste that he was from was Hindu, but his people were the ones that would they would move cows from their part of Bihar down to Kolkata to be butchered by the Muslims. If you know anything about Hinduism, that is just forbidden, utterly forbidden. So they were doing the dirty work, and they were working on behalf of the Muslims, which is even more forbidden and more dirty. So the whole thing is a mess. So Manan was one of these guys, just kind of rough. You kind of thinking, I'm sure in Australia you guys have just Wild West rough people, and we do too in the US, just rough. And but he had come to faith. I think it's important to know this guy, we did not lead him to faith. Someone had done that work in Bihar before us, had laid the foundation. He accepted Christ. His discipleship was almost entirely lacking, but his faith was there in Jesus. And so he comes in, and he brought 2 or 3 with him. And this guy, we trained their leaders. We started off with basic evangelism. Again, Romans Road, just a go-to tool that we used. And we were using it, 4 verses, and a really simple 7 commands of Christ. It was all storying, all of it. They couldn't read. Again, rough guys, right? When did they get a chance to get educated? They didn't, too busy moving cows. So Manan, these guys really get turned on for sharing the gospel and making disciples. And they go back and they share a lot. And I don't have a number for you, Steve, but by the time we go back a month later, there's 20 believers now. And so now they're beginning to baptize them. And we began to share, train those, and then have the first few who were still faithful to become the trainers of evangelism and disciple making. And then we spent, we were going in, I'd say 3 days a month for 6 months and spending 3 solid days with these leaders. And then so we were walking through disciple making and then church formation and then helping them become leaders and raise up their own leaders from within. And as we did that, Munnen, you know, he's growing in his faith. He's leading others to grow in their faith, and now we're starting to see multiplication through generations. And within the first year, there was a good percentage of his people that had heard the gospel and responded to the gospel. And I remember calculating it because remember, Steve, we went in thinking they were unengaged completely, meaning no gospel witness, and unreached, meaning less than 2%. If there was gospel, there's nothing, right?
Mm.
So we were still using that 2% marker as a benchmark for what does it mean to be reached. And within the first year, we felt pretty confident that we were getting close to 2% of those people actually coming to faith in Jesus. They were so hungry for belief. They were just, these people were down and out. I mean, the worst. And they were given hope, and they were given it by their own people, Munnen and his team. And so they began to multiply pretty quickly the gospel. And so it went, in our estimation, nothing's perfect with this, but it went from, very, very low percentage in the 0.0 something percent to the 2% range very quickly among a population segment of 250,000. And in some ways that looks like, wow, success, let's leave, let's move on. 2%, they're reached. I used my air quotes in reach because that's pretty ambiguous, but we kept working and plugging away and helping them with their church formation and drawing gen maps and all the other things, that you would expect. So that's Munnen. At the same time, I'll just offer this story too, because I think we stumbled upon something that we didn't intend, but ended up being a fruitful practice for us. We were bringing all of these unreached, unengaged peoples that had come to faith in Jesus into the capital city there in Bihar, Patna. And they would come 3 days a month and go out. And the whole purpose with this was so that we could focus our energies on an entire state of unreached, unengaged, so that we weren't chasing. Remember, we had so much trouble in the previous context, chasing all these leaders, and we just went shallow. So we were trying to get them to come in. We would spend those days eating, sleeping, laughing, harvesting with them. And then they would go out. And our focus was never the city. Our focus was always the unreached in the village. Okay, so that was what we went in thinking. We'll just train them, equip them. Well, as one does when you're training, you go out in the harvest and you practice everything you're doing. I forgot to say this, Steve. We started off with doing month-long trainings, because if they were coming in, we wanted to spend a month with them and really going deep. And so what that looks like is, if you're walking through the 4 fields process, we would spend a week on entry EV, a week on disciple making, church formation, leadership development. And so all the time, like half a day would be spent sort of together in a room, practicing tools, learning tools, practicing, and then we'd be out in the harvest. Well, the goal with this was we would start work in all of these unreached rural areas. But what happened was, and we weren't prepared for it and we failed, was during their practice, in that first month, they started 17 small churches in Patna in the first month, because they were out faithfully sharing the gospel every day. And then they were taking people to the Ganges River and baptizing them. And then they were starting everything they would learn, they would go and do. Not all of them, but many of them. So they started 17 small church starts. And we were not prepared for even one. And so what happened was, in fact, all but one basically dissipated into thin air once our people, after the end of the month, left and went back to their villages. Just caught us unaware. So that was the first training cycle we did. We took a step back, we evaluated, and we're like, wow, we imported laborers with the intention that they would reach their own people back home. But we imported laborers for a month in a mega city in South Asia, and they saw fruit. Can we anticipate the Spirit's move again and make sure we have our act together this time so that whatever fruit is started in the city through just practice of faithfulness, whatever is started, can we then go nurture that fruit and make sure that that witness continues in the city as well as
Mm.
transplants to the homelands, right? And so round two, we got a little better. I think they started more, but they maintained about five sort of home churches because we were intentional about training people within the city to follow up with the work and continue the work when the others went home. So we went through multiple iterations of this to try and hone it down to, can we target a megacity by bringing laborers from the outside? And can we then transplant the same DNA back to the unengaged groups across a vast landscape? So I want to jump to, I'm going to call him Dalit. You and I know him. We talked about him earlier. Um, so I was living in Delhi and I was going in and out of UP and Bihar at this point, several days a month in both places. And then um, the Lord began laying on my heart. There was, again, looking at the UUPGs around Haryana and Delhi and Punjab, there were many. And so laying on my heart, how do we get to the same thing we're seeing again, like a sandbox in Patna and in Varanasi and those places? How do we get to that and that sort of faithfulness in the Delhi area? And so uh, I began when my days that I was there, and plus my family was growing and I needed to be home a little more. So I actually went to my wife and said, look, we either need to pray about moving to Bihar or we need to pray that the Lord is going to open up more work here that can multiply out. And so we just spent some weeks actually praying. And my wife, through another missionary friend, my wife met a pastor named Dalip. That's not his real name, but it's a good
Mm.
name, Dalip. And Dalip, she actually offered to do like a marriage training for Dalip and the women of his church, and that's how they met. And then while they were meeting at that marriage training, she just said, "Hey, my husband's looking for opportunities to train here closer to home. Would you guys be interested in some evangelism discipleship training?" Sure, we'd do that. So Dalip calls his leadership team together. Dalip, by the way, comes from a Jesus film background from Crew. And so a lot of faithfulness in taking the gospel and the film into all these places. And those guys they're a gem to any network because especially in contexts like Africa and India, because they know every evangelist and pastor because they've gone to every village and shown the
Mm.
Jesus film. So they know everybody and they've been faithful to do this work. So he came from that background, had become independent, started a church. His church, he would say, you know, he wanted a mega church. Let's be honest. That was the model he saw. That's the model he wanted. And so he moved to this town where we were living, just out on the outskirts of Delhi, and planted his life. And he had seen about 40 people come to faith. He was doing good work, raised up a leadership team. They had branched off once or twice and had cell groups going in a couple parts of the city. And so we started training with him, and I casted heavy vision for him. I mean, really heavy vision
Mm.
for the unreached and unengaged, because that was a filter for me. I wanted to know who was interested in sort of ends of the earth type work. I was happy to help train, happy to help evangelize and do whatever,
Mm.
but I really wanted to spend my time with those guys who wanted to go to the empty spots. And so we talked through it multiple times, and then we decided that we would fast and pray together and see if the Lord was in this partnership. Like
Mm.
if the Lord was calling him to this, if the Lord was calling me to unite with him in this. And so we fasted for a week, I think it was, and prayed and just sought the face of Jesus, looking for to see if this was the way to go. And both of us at the end of that week decided, let's go for it. So we began to
Mm.
identify the unreached, unengaged. The first thing I did was I took him to Patna, to Bihar, to see what was going on in those groups, saying, look, it doesn't have to look like this, but you should at least see what's going on and see if it's worthwhile. Then I took the main leaders that were in Bihar and brought them back to the Delhi area to help me with training and equipping and sort of bringing a hot coal back, and what does it look like to engage these unengaged? And so we started with this core team of, gosh, I can't remember exactly how many, 8 maybe, that we just trained with, we equipped, we would go out into the harvest and share. We were intentionally focused on the unengaged. Then, as they were networking, we did the same thing. We would bring those unengaged people in to the Delhi area. We started with 2-week or 3-week trainings, but the same rhythms. They would come in, they would be our laborers in the city, and then we would send them home to labor, and we would follow up. So they came in, and they were starting with through Dalip's leadership, uh, because he was a local leader and we were training his local leaders. They would start groups within the city, and we would follow up with them. And many times, they would find their own, at least language groups around us, which was great. So we were breaking in to large parts of India based on being in the hub, right? And so this is like Ephesian movement, right? So we we're we're working in. We had this little. Actually, we had a little training center, and in my mind, this is an Acts 19 Hall of Tyrannus. We'll call it the Hall of Dalit. And so we would spend all of our time and energy in with those people, sending them out, and then the work began all around us, in these far-flung regions around us. And some of it was all the way across India, but a large part we were focusing on Haryana, Punjab, and the Delhi, and some in Rajasthan as well, the upper part of Rajasthan, just to keep the spokes a little closer home to home, so that we could get on a train and visit these spots when the Lord opened. So with Dalip, it began to grow really quick. His leaders, not all of them, out of the 8 or so, say 4 or 5 of them began to multiply very quickly. And then those guys would begin networking and training further out, and those began to multiply. And we were seeing small churches in many regions quickly. One brother, his name is actually David, but there's enough Davids, I'll just say his name, was pretty unfaithful in the beginning in this inner circle. And months go by, we're meeting regularly, we're doing disciple making. Others are starting to multiply disciple makers. He's just doing nothing. And so I'm a little agitated. Dalip is agitated. And so we conspire and we sit down, we just have a word with him, almost an ultimatum, like, listen, David, if this is, if the Lord's put this on your heart, let us help you. What's the problem? If not, let's empty this seat right here and we'll get someone else that wants our time and energy. How do we fill the slot? This is months into it. And he felt convicted at that conversation. He goes home and he's just praying all the way home, like, Lord, I think you're in this. Show me a sign. I want to find an unreached, unengaged people or person today. So, I don't know why India is this way, but it is. Sometimes they're right next door to you and you just don't even know. This guy goes home, he's praying this, and he just takes a step across the street, like a dirt street, across the village street into this like informal settlement, and shares the gospel with a group of gypsies. And several of them come to faith, like several of them. I want to say like in the 30s come to faith.
Because
Immediately.
there are gypsy people in India. There's a thought that's
Yeah,
where they originated.
that's exactly right. If you follow their lineage, they came from probably somewhere in southern India and have moved across the world. But so those people are still there, and gypsy camp is a gypsy camp. So he goes into an informal gypsy camp, shares the gospel. So 30 people come to faith. David, like really the first time he's won someone to faith. He is like me. He is a Baptist background believer. He grew up in a Baptist church that was totally dead, no gospel, and got saved, and then now is sharing the gospel with gypsies. Well, day one of the gypsies says, 7 kilometers down the road, there's another gypsy camp. We know all those. Can we go there? Okay. David's unprepared. They get in whatever transport 7 kilometers down the road, and like dozens more come to faith. It happens 3 times in this first day. Gypsy camp to gypsy camp to gypsy camp. By this time it's evening, and now they've got like I guess, an evangelism movement, if you will,
Mm.
in three camps in one day. Now, remember, this is the first time he's really shared the gospel. Turns out, Steve, that he, unbeknownst to David, on our list of peoples was that specific gypsy group and their language,
Mm.
meaning on our unreached and unengaged people group list were those people, right? He didn't know that. He just was praying and wanted to share the gospel and try his, dip his toe in the water. And he begins this evangelism movement with one of our unengaged, unreached people groups. Okay, so it continues. Well, one of them was pregnant, and for some reason, she comes to faith in Jesus. I I don't know, it is foul play. They received a lot of persecution from the outside, not because they came to faith in Jesus, but because uh, their faith in Jesus instantly convicted them to stop doing the gypsy tasks that they were doing, stealing cell phones, pickpocketing. So they cut that out immediately. I don't know what it is. The spirit just was heavy on them. Well, they don't have any other, like, they've been raised to like juggle and pickpocket. That's all they do. So the community relies on everyone pulling their weight in pickpocketing and stealing cell phones. What happens if in your community of 100, 30 of them stop doing that?
Mm.
Persecution happens. That's what happens. So they get persecuted because they're not pulling their weight economically. I mean, really bad persecuted, beaten, run out. One of them was a pregnant lady who actually died. I don't know. I don't know the whole story. The
Mm.
baby dies, she dies. Well, because it was a pregnant lady, the police get involved. And gypsies in informal settlements, no one trusts the police in most of the world. But in this situation, no one trusts the police. They come in and the gypsies scattered, gone, all of them. Unbelievers, believers just disappear. Nothing but trash left behind. And so we lose contact with some of these guys for months. When they resurface, because they're, afraid for their lives, what if they get taken in and accused for the death of this woman and the unborn child? This is bad news. Well, again, David is at the forefront of this movement. He is not even just becoming faithful himself. Well, we get news from UP, like hundreds of miles away, that these gypsies from this particular people group, from this language dialect in Haryana, Haryanvi speaking, have now transplanted for fear of their life to a gypsy camp in UP. They're in UP, and guess what happens, Steve? They share the gospel. And guess what happens? People come to faith. And then people start being baptized and discipled in those gypsy camps. And we look on our list in UP, guess who's on our unreached, unengaged people group list?
Mm.
That people group with their language. Same tribe, different language group. So we classified them as different entities on our list. And so the gospel just begins to uncontrollably begin to spread from gypsy camp to gypsy camp in these two states that bordered each other. So we that one was very difficult to track, very difficult to measure, because the people is just so fluid. They go wherever they're on the run all the time, and wherever they can get opportunities, um, but I will say this: Dalip and his team were doing their best to invest. And when I talked to him, it's been a while since we've talked about this one, but they still had some leaders I mean, they're raising up leaders, maturing them, helping them learn how to read because who taught them how to read? Never went to school. So they were helped with literacy so that they could read the Bible and get jobs. That was the motive.
Mm.
Like, let's get these guys. They need the Word of God, and they need to be able to support themselves. And so they have an inner circle within these gypsy communities that are actually raising up and becoming strong leaders. I'm convinced that Matthew 28 is for all of us, all who believe and profess Jesus as our Savior. Now, if Jesus gave that commission, surely, Steve, it wasn't a fool's errand. Did he give us the commission and not show us how to do it? Like, surely the Savior of the universe would show us how to do it. So I'm convicted that we can go back and look through the Gospels and say, how did Jesus do this, right? Mark 3, right? He He had this rhythm with disciples. He called them to be with him and to send them out and to proclaim the gospel, right? So there's these rhythms of harvest and the way he trained and the way you see it, Luke 8, 9, and 10. So I'm convinced, and I want to instill that in my family and me. I want that to be me and my kids, but it also needs to be any partner I leave behind. Don't look at this guy, look at Jesus, look at the word. Honestly, I just have a deep conviction. Um, it just sounds so corny when I think through it, Steve. But I want to see the knowledge of the glory of the Lord cover the world as it covers the sea. And I know that sounds corny.